Undermining a united front. Criticisms of identity politics from the left. In the previous chapter, I made the case that there is no reason to exclude economic class as an identity group. However, it is true that IP does at times look at issues solely on race, gender, LGBTQIA, without consideration for class analysis. From the political left, this has been met with criticism that focusing on IP issues undermines the socialist project, or in other words, that undermines our ability to present a united front against capitalism due to being distracted by IP issues. One of the most nuanced arguments for this comes from Adolph Reed Jr. Reed, 2018, has argued against what he describes as race reductionism. His criticism of race reductionism is that by separating race issues from class issues, it ignores both the historical relationship between class and race, therefore also ignores a major cause of the problem. Furthermore, by only focusing on race, it reinforces the neoliberal economic structure that creates the inequalities that people of color disproportionately represent. Neoliberalism is the belief that capitalism should not only exist, but should exist with minimal government interference on the market. For example, Reed has mentioned that when proponents of IP criticize Bernie Sanders of not focusing on black issues, Reed says he responds to such criticisms by asking him which of Sanders' policies doesn't disproportionately improve the lives of African Americans. This is because since Sanders' policies are targeted at improving the lives of the working class, which is the economic class African Americans disproportionately represent. One of the problems with focusing only on IP, according to Reed, is attempting to have different genders and races equally represented without addressing the problems of capitalism. Only creates a world where all demographics are equally represented in an unequal society. Reed has been quoted, B. Norton, 2015, to express the problem in this way. Within that moral economy, a society in which 1% of the population controlled 90% of the resources could be just, provided that roughly 12% of the 1% were black, 12% were Latino, 50% were women, and whatever the appropriate proportions were LGBT people. Reed notes that there are many on the left side of politics that support neoliberalism, either because they think it cannot be replaced by socialism or that it shouldn't be. Reed, 2018, gives an example of Hillary Clinton's criticism of Bernie Sanders, where he quotes her saying, "Not everything is about economic theory, right? If we broke up the big banks tomorrow, and I will, if they deserve it, if they pose a systemic risk, I will. Would that end racism? Would that end sexism? Would that end discrimination against the LGBT community? Would that make people feel more welcoming to immigrants overnight? Would that solve our problem with voting rights and Republicans who are trying to strip them away from people of color, the elderly, the young?" Although I agree with Reed that this statement by Clinton was dismissive of the focus on economic issues, it does contain a grain of truth. When we observe countries that have considerably less inequality than others, we do not always see a similar reduction in issues regarding gender and race. Take, for example, Scandinavian countries such as Denmark and Norway. According to the World Bank, when we look at Denmark and Norway's Gini coefficient is the measurement of a country's inequality, with 0% representing all wealth being equally distributed and 100% representing one person owning all the wealth and everyone else owning nothing. Denmark's is 28.5% and Norway's is 26.8%. In contrast, the United States Gini coefficient is 41.5%, the United Kingdom's is 34.1%, and Australia's is 34.7%. Hence, the degree of inequality is significantly less in Denmark and Norway than typical democratic Western countries. Given the significantly lower degree of inequality, we should expect a comparatively lower experience in race and gender issues if Clinton's criticisms were incorrect. However, in a 2013 poll, M. Fisher 2013, all countries mentioned in the previous paragraph found that 0 to 5% of the population said that they did not want people from another race as neighbours, even though the countries mentioned vary significantly in their Gini coefficient. Some had a higher Gini coefficient and others were lower. This suggests that the degree of inequality does not necessarily influence issues regarding racial tolerance. One could object that these issues still exist since none of these countries are not socialist. At best, they are social democracies, capitalist economies that have significant government involvement and safety nets. Hence, resolving such issues require a complete transition of the economic structure from capitalist to socialist. Although this objection may be true, there is no guarantee that identity-based injustices will disappear with the transition away from capitalism, even if many of the racial issues were a construction of the capitalist system. For instance, would becoming a socialist country address the stigmatization of transgender persons that influences their disproportionate rate of suicide? The answer to this question is not obvious, and to ask transgender persons to ignore those issues for the purpose of class analysis simply asks too much of them. Our earlier discussion on universal humanism and empathy can also be applied here. To ask transgender persons to only see themselves through the lens of class results in the same problems as only seeing themselves as human beings, absent of any other special relationships. Thus, although race reductionism is something that ought to be avoided, class reductionism ought to be avoided as well, and inclusion of class as one of those intersections in IP avoids both problems. To be fair to Reid, class reductionism is a position I don't think he is advocating for. In fact, Reid, 2019, wrote an article addressing what he calls the myth of class reductionism. Nonetheless, there are many people, rightly or wrongly, interpreting the inclusion of class analysis as class reductionism. So, there is no harm in communicating to those groups how class and identity can intersect with one another. An objection may be raised that class ought to be the focus because it is class that is fundamental, not race or gender. For example, in Frederick Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, Engels, 1884, makes a compelling argument that the gender roles that we are used to in modern society came about through the development of class divisions. Hence, if this is true, then we ought to focus on overthrowing the root cause of these gender roles many feminists are critical of. And in this case, the root cause would be the capitalist economic structure. However, although the social construction of gender roles may very well have its origins in capitalism, there are two requests that are required of women if we ask to focus solely on capitalism. The first is that issues specific to them that can be addressed within the capitalism must be ignored, because to address them either supports capitalism or assumes no alternative. The second is that once overthrowing capitalism is achieved, women now just need to wait until the social constructions around gender evolve to socialism, which will be much more egalitarian than capitalism. The problem with these requests is that once again unnecessarily asks too much of those belonging to oppressed identity groups. We can consistently deal with race and gender-based issues within an existing capitalist system, whilst also campaigning for replacement of that system. To say that we can only deal with class exclusively or gender exclusively is to commit a false dichotomy. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. That said, we should also acknowledge that challenging capitalism is a necessary condition to fully addressing identity-based issues. And this is ultimately what I believe the CRC meant when they talked about expanding Marxism.